Welcome everyone to our first and last webinar of this year. The first since the new committee came in. And I think many of you are members, but some of you are not members of the Editors Guild of India. And I just want to clarify, because there's so many things said about EGI. We are not, and there's so many expectations. We are not a statutory body. We are a voluntary body of about 200 editors from different parts of India who have come together and came together in 1978 to come together and to take up issues concerning the media. It could be media issues about rights, protection from the state, accountability, responsibilities, ethics, the way media should function, a whole bunch of things that had come up, particularly after the emergency. And it was decided that if there's a voluntary group of editors, perhaps we would be able to bring in some meaning into media functioning as a whole. So this is really what we are charged with. And we are also, apart from looking at our code of functioning, of looking at the laws, of seeing what the media itself can do and should be doing and is not doing, or is doing what it should not be doing. All these issues are there on the table in front of us. So one of the important elements of this is programs through webinars and through a reach out to people, journalists and non-journalists as well, where we are able to highlight issues of concern. One of the issues has been reporting from conflict areas, which includes the Northeast, which includes Jammu and Kashmir, and which also includes any area which is turned into a conflict zone at any particular point in time, we've been seeing a lot of that. And we've always found and have been very very aware of the fact that voices from the Northeast and from these conflict areas are not heard in Delhi and are not known. And the kind of problems that the people face and our journalists face in these far-flung areas are not brought to light. I mean, we know that there was the period of insurgency, there was the state control, and the journalists feel the pressure from both in these kind of situations. So we have a program committee, which is an important committee, which is looking after organizing such interactions. We have Kumkum Chadda, who is the convener, who's played a very active role in putting this all together. Along with her is Alok Joshi, Sanjeev Srivastava, and Sankarshan Thakur. So our program committee, you're going to be hearing from them a lot more. And they put this together under Kumkum and with very serious help from Alok, in record time. And we are, of course, very happy that our speakers have all agreed to be part of this webinar at very short notice. We will be counting on you over and over again, and we hope that we are going to be able to shed light on issues of this kind, because this kind of highlighting is extremely important to us as a body and to the Editors Guild of India. So we have Sanjoy Hazarika, Teresa, Ranju, Pradeep, all people we have worked with in the past, and people who have a great deal to say, who are credible journalists recognized in the Northeast of India particularly. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Sanjay Kapoor, to moderate the session. So Sanjay, all yours.
Thanks a lot, Seema, for telling everybody what EGI is and its mandate. I'm delighted to host this program, the first edition of Unheard Voices, especially coming in from Northeast, which is a very difficult area. I think conflict really challenged media like nothing does, because there's a crossfire between the state forces and that of the insurgents, and it really strains objectivity, causes great problems. And if you look at Northeast, there are 8 states and there are four international challenges which are there across the border. So there are 99% of the border is with foreign countries and only 1% with India. So I'm not going to take much of your time and get Sanjoy Hazarika to tell us about the challenges that journalists face, and especially when it comes to writing. Sanjoy is an old timer. We've known him for long years. He used to work for New York Times, and then he's become a human rights activist, scholar, author, journalist, and filmmaker, recognized internationally by for designing and developing innovative strategies for inclusive health and governance. But more so, we're going to listen from him, his experience as a journalist, and what it really means to report from. And he's not an unheard voice. We have this program called His Voice is pretty loud and clear and heard at a lot of places. Thanks. So all to you, Sanjoy.
Thanks, Sanjay, and thanks for making the clarification that I am Sanjoy. So, and thanks for the introduction. A quick point of referencing. Uh, the borders of the Northeast are 96% with other countries, not 99. We 4% are with India, which is still a very small amount. And what I thought today, I was speaking with Kumkum and others, and I thought I'll just sketch a general, building both on my own experiences and work and research, as well as the larger issues before the region. Over the past 60 odd years, insurgency has grown, flowed, and ebbed over different parts of the area we call the Northeast. First in the Naga Hills, in the Mizo Hills in Manipur before coming to Assam. And there have been several stages during this whole period of history, post-independence, post-47. There have been several stages of reporting from and in the Northeast. The region that we call the Northeast, for lack of perhaps a better phrase, is a constant, I call it a constant harvest of stories which can turn into platforms for building reputations, but also connecting and building better understanding between the region and its people and the rest of the country. And I will look at four phases of reportage, shall we say, and how the narratives have grown. The first part, the initial part, I did not see myself, but it is something that we've read about from other books and also from our parents, which is the state versus the insurgency, beginning in the 1950s in the Naga Hills. And this is a phase which started then, but continued until the Shillong Accord between one faction of the Naga movement and the government of India in 1975. Ordinary people faced or were collateral damage. Many of those stories never got into the Indian media and public domain, although they did get into the Western domain, including articles in the Observer, the Times, and the Guardian. I'm really speaking of the 1960s. And the narrative was essentially that India needed to ensure political stability, national security, and territorial integrity, all these things. And having gone through the nightmare of partition, no one in government wanted to allow fragmentation. What they feared was fragmentation. The full force of the military was hurled at the insurgencies. And a phrase that often made it to papers like the Assam Tribune and the Statesman, which were the newspapers of record of the time, and which I read as a young person growing up in Shillong, or listened to All India Radio, because there was no television, and as we all know, there was certainly no internet. The phrase which was used to describe the rebels or the insurgents, call them what you will, was hostiles. So one would be Naga hostiles or Mizo hostiles. It was never anything else. And that got embedded, shall we say, in the media narrative. So the media at that time was driven by the state narrative. And how many of us, even in this virtual room, apart from people like Pradeep and Ranju and Teresa, know that in March 1966, the government of India strafed Aizawl with Air Force jets because of the uprising there, which had taken place on 28th February 66. And this was largely until the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, this was largely reporting through the government lens. And this phase of what I would call the national media, that national narrative of that time came about because there is very little in terms of the media in the Northeast, barring the Assam Tribune and some language papers. The most powerful coverage came from the Statesman and the Ananda Bazar Patrika group, from which later the Telegraph emerged. In the 1970s, changes began to come about in the 1990s with the rise of the Assam agitation against illegal migration, the surge in insurgency in Manipur and Nagaland, and with new media beginning to grow and sympathetic writing for the movements and conflicts which brought in people's voices. So that began to change. And some independent voices in the 80s and top journalists, people who really made a reputation for themselves, whether you like them or not, Shekhar Gupta, Prasanth Sonowal, and others cut their teeth there in the region. Bureaus open not just with local writers, but reporters who are assigned from the main desk to the region. There were a few of them who, the headquarters, I can remember at least two reporters who were not wanted in Delhi by that particular newspaper, and they were banished to what they thought were the boondocks, where they could trouble nobody. But did very little work, and they were paid for it, not doing any work. By the 1990s, some of the media houses started investing in publishing there because they saw an opportunity for advertisement and outreach. The Telegraph and the Times of India being major figures. And this brought them into some confrontation with regional media because the leaders of the regional media felt that their space and readers were being stolen, as well as the advertising revenue. But local media continued to grow, if not thrive. And slowly, television and local channels grew, often with political patronage. Many journalists like Pradeep Panjwam returned, and Teresa returned from Delhi and elsewhere, and to their home states to build capacity, to start new initiatives, and we'll hear from them. So a growth was also visible in the professionalism and capacity building that they brought back home. But there remained a huge dependence on government advertising. This also meant that many sensitive stories would not be reviewed or looked at, except by a tribe of new, hungry, and independent media like Hadin in Assam, which are seen as anti-establishment and pro-Ulfa at one point. And that's where you see the difference between what's called the national media and the regional media. Many of you here are seen as the national media. The national media, there is nothing called the national media, there is only the metro media. We have regional media, but it's not really regional media, it's media of the states, and sometimes of the places within the states instead of the region itself. Now, during this whole time, there's been phases when the media has been extremely vulnerable, not just to pressure, but to violence, not just to intimidation, but to death and great risk. And not less, I think, than 7 or 8 journalists have been killed this past decade. And I recall several of them. Some of them were killed mysteriously, and some of them were killed in public view. Like Parag Das, the founder editor of Protidin, Kamla Das, who spoke out against insurgency in Assam. The reporters from Manipur Prime, Bizimani Singh, who was killed while recording a protest, and similarly, Shantanu Bhaumik from Tripura was killed during a protest that he was reporting. Now, so we have moved from a time of reporting on insurgency, whether it's sympathetically, otherwise going out, getting the stories, to a point when that whole universe has changed, and now insurgencies are on the back foot or in dialogue or they're in detention camps or in conversations. So it's really now about new challenges, new initiatives. It's about covering the peace, not the broken peace, but covering the peace. It's about covering ethnic mobilization, the rights of communities and individuals and that of the state, the power of the state, the issues of citizenship and migration, and can a balance be struck? This is what I think everybody struggles with, and some people don't even struggle with it, they just don't strike a balance. The cutting in costs, which you'll have seen, the shrinking economy has affected the media industry hugely. Thousands of people have been laid off across the country, and not just in one part of it, not just in Delhi or Bombay or Madras, but also in the northeastern states. And now with the pandemic, that means that there are greater risks and challenges before us. This means the last part of what I was going to say is that this means that the way people are reporting is not just depending on the old style of reporting, but it's using new technology, it's using cost-cutting measures, it's using technology to reach out to communities, to reach out to the story, but you're not really sure whether you're getting the story unless you go there. It's because you may be talking to somebody, but that person may not be where he says he is. Or you may be seeing something, but you may not be seeing what you think you should be seeing for your story. So how do we, this dependence on sources and all that is a great challenge. And it comes down to a point where today one person has to report, edit, and broadcast. And in the region of the Northeast, we find that in print journalism, the person, it's still the same. The person who's covering the chief minister in the morning is covering a sports event in the afternoon and is editing his own story at night because there's not enough staff, money to pay enough staff, or he is also suddenly has been tossed a judgment, a court judgment, which he has to decipher and write about for the next paper. The challenges, I think, therefore, are multifold. They are new, and we'll hear from our panelists on that. One is something that has been there for a long time, which is the lack of insurance. And this is something I know that Sanjay and others, Seema and others, you looked at this issue, I hope. But the need for the insurance of journalists who are in difficult conditions, challenging conditions, and who don't just walk the talk, but do so at great risk to themselves and their families. That is something that I hope you will be able to look at, because this is really an issue in that region and other parts. You have the threat of violence and intimidation against people. You've had an editor like Patricia Mukim, whose house has been firebombed. There are others in Arunachal Pradesh, of course, Rima and others who faced violence at the hands of others. But at the same time, you have young, really fine professional reporters like Tara Agarwala from the Indian Express, who are reporting from the region to their editors and editions across the country. Similarly, many from the region are now within what we call the national or the metro media. They are anchors, they are reporters, they're editors, and so on. So you see this growth as the Northeastern story changes and moves with time. This also is part of the narrative. This also is changing. But I will close with two things, and because I am conscious of the fact that there is a time issue here. 11 years ago, August 2009, an NDTV anchor, I think she put together an article, a program called The Warrior Tribes of Nagaland. And let me quote: "The more I voyaged, civilization, as I was already aware of it, as I was already aware, was left far behind. After she crosses a bridge in a four-wheel, vehicle and enters Nagaland." That was some years ago, and I think that element of knowing more, that element of uh, unspoken prejudice and ignorance is still very much there. I mean, Rajdeep Sardesai, this does talk about the tyranny of distance and does occasionally bring together programs and reportage from the region. But I will talk about an anchor who did a show in which I was there and on the floods in Assam. It's only when I was informed a few minutes before the show that we realized it was going to be on Kaziranga and how the floods were affecting wildlife in Kaziranga, not really how it was affecting people. And I had much more to say about people than about wildlife. We have to respect ecosystems, sentient beings, but we also have to recognize we live in a world where people suffer also greatly. So, the other thing that I wanted to share, and I'll close with that really, is there are some things that have endured apart from this lack of knowledge or maybe growing knowledge, but still there is a gap, there are gaps which need to be bridged, is the issue of discrimination. And this is something that I'm sure my friends from here, whether it's Delhi or elsewhere, the metros, feel that's rather overdone and it's been done for many years. Well, the fact is that it's not going away. It's an issue that hasn't gone away. It's an issue that remains. And it was visible in the initial weeks of the pandemic when people were spat upon. They were called names like China virus. There were people who were denied access to grocery stores because they happened to be from Nagaland and the people at the store thought they were Chinese. And this is a story not just of the Northeast, it's a story you find in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, and in Southeast Asia, where anybody who looks, even in Southeast Asia, somebody who looks akin to Chinese was actually virtually branded and discriminated against and abused. So we need to be very, very critical ourselves of this kind of approach. We need to report about it very aggressively and very clearly and very precisely, because we are in a time of fake news. We are in a time when news is commodified to an extent we cannot imagine, when bots drive narratives and narratives drive policy, and policies lead to further exacerbation of these challenges. So it is very important for us as journalists, as media people today, when we are swamped by information and disinformation and misinformation, to have the right tools to really prize out what the stories are, prize out what are the facts, and stick to them. Because at the end of the day, we are still journalists who need to report the facts, not what others want to pass off as facts. And that, to me, is at the key, at the heart of the issue. If there are some other thoughts and questions, I will come back to them at the end. But I think that bridge building is really necessary between the region. Now you have people like Raju, Teresa, Pradeep, and others who are in the region, and bridge building with them who are professionals, who have a lot of experience, should be something that we should really do, especially with people who are freelancers and independent journalists who are really the well springs of truth. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sanjoy, for lending perspective to a very difficult region especially when it comes to reporting from there, especially in an environment where there's a conflict for many years and now you have new challenges which has come in. I think I'll get Pradeep Fanjumom, who's from Manipur. He's seen, I think, both the phases when the conflict used to dominate headlines, and sometime it didn't do it here, but I think people in that region suffered from the violence that this really causes in their lives. So, and he let him talk about the conflict and now how the new situation is evolving, and if he can share any of those incidents that influence his reporting.
Thank you very much. And let me just begin where Sanjoy left, so that I can, and I'll carry on to what you are asking me. But to what
you can weave in the way you want. I mean,
okay, yeah. So I was just preparing in my mind how I should present this thing, but then Sanjoy gave me the idea that how did the Northeast come to be so alienated? Why is it not there in the imagination of the nation as it should be? That I will begin from there, and I will start off. I think it's a good flagging up point. An article in 2013 which I read, and written by Ashok Mitra, the late Ashok Mitra, the CPM ideologue in Calcutta. He used to be a columnist for the Telegraph, and he said that, and I mean, a very, very revealing kind of a scenario he created. He said in 1938, Burma was separated from India. Burma was part of India till then. I mean, in 1985, it was taken over by the British, the entire Burma. And I mean, they had 3 wars with Burma, we know that. And they had 3 wars with Burma, and after each war, they took over some part of territory. 1885 was the last, and they took over the entire Burma. And they became part of British India. And that was what British India was about, Burma included. But in 1938, in accordance to the Government of India Act 1935, Burma was separated from India. And 1938 is at the height of the freedom movement. And there was not a squeak of protest when Burma was separated. When a part of India was separated from India, there was not even a squeak of protest. And he was suggesting that if the Northeast was also separated and made into a different entity at that time, probably it would have been the same. There wouldn't have been too much of a protest, and Northeast could have been a separate country as it is. And indeed, the British had plans for this. They had David Simley has done a book on how there were 4 British plans to actually have the Northeast as a separate entity after the British left, and that plan was being and the most famous of these plans was by somebody called Robert Reid. He was the governor of Assam, and in 1938, in fact, he came out with a report saying that there should be a crown colony made up of the mountainous region of the Northeast, and as well as part of Burma, the other side, and what later people like James Scott have called Zomia. That portion, he said, are different, very different from Burma as well as from India. So we should have it as a separate country. And he was going to make it a crown colony. They were even deciding where the capital should be. And ultimately it boiled down to Shillong and Imphal. But ultimately there were protests from other civil servants, British civil servants, both in Burma as well as here, that the place will be ungovernable if you make it into a separate thing. And ultimately that plan was dropped. But the fact is, this thing remains, like what Ashok Mitra said. Ashok Mitra said that if the Northeast was separated at the time, maybe there wouldn't have been a protest. And if, of course, now it's different. As Gunnar Myrdal, he once said, he was quoted by Neville Maxwell, where he said, what the colonizers left behind will become the sacred territory of the new nations. And that's what happened. And if the colonizers had left behind Burma as well as India, then Burma would have been the sacred territory of India. That's a part of Burma, and then the whole nation will actually wake up, will go mad. But that's happening with the Northeast. The Northeast didn't get separated at the time, but now it's part of the nation, and yet it is not still coming into the national consciousness. That something happens there, and then you really have to be shouting loud, or maybe sometimes when you go into violent means of protest, then only you get noticed. So maybe there's also that knee-jerk kind of response that you know that you're going to be heard only if you do something radical. So people go for those radical thing because of this insensitivity. That if there was a small protest, if a memorandum was heard, if it is reasonable, if it is heard, then maybe there wouldn't have been too much of a protest as it is now. But that kind of thing was not happening. I'm not saying this is the only reason, but this could be actually feeding into that conflict dynamics, that you're not heard, you're not there in the national consciousness. So you have to actually scream to be heard. And that actually has come to be what it is. But the alienation has also done one more thing, that some of the most draconian laws, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, and also the NSA, the UAPA, these things apply so freely in the Northeast, ASPA especially, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, Kashmir and Northeast, it is applicable. And there also the national consciousness, the conscience that there's something being violated by these acts is not actually registering too much. That why this is supposed to be a law, you follow the law, nothing will happen, that kind of an attitude. The actual conflict that's happening there is not actually the entire dimension of it is not actually registering with the rest of the nation, which is why when human rights violations are taking place there, there's still counter arguments saying that this is that violation is earned, that kind of an attitude. And here I would like to just to come back to what the difficulties that journalists face in reporting conflict here, and this has relation to this particular thing about the state and non-state conflict, where the reporters are also blamed sometimes of actually calling violation by the state only that as human rights violation. But when the insurgents do it, you don't do that. That's the kind of allegation that we get often. And this also, again, is that same insensitivity. And also, of course, I want to point out that the journalists actually doing what they are supposed to, because that's how the law is. That's how the law that the Human Rights Charter is supposed to be an international law, and for that to be applicable, it was actually, when it was drawn up, it was actually meant as a device to check the state. We all saw that happening. It came about after the Second World War, after the Jewish pogrom and all that. So once upon a time during the Enlightenment age, people thought the state was the ultimate mechanism to bring prosperity and welfare for the people and all that. But suddenly after World War, people realized that the state can also violate the rights of the individuals grievously, which is why the human rights movement came up. And the human rights movement was actually meant to check the state. And if there's violation by another party, say if it's the insurgent or anybody, that's not a human rights violation. That's a law and order problem. Supposing I get beaten up, when I walk out of my room, I get beaten up and harassed by somebody or some thugs. That's not a human rights violation. That's a law and order problem. I can go and complain to the state. I can complain to the police. But if the police was doing it in a systematic way, for no reason, for reasons that I don't agree, that is not there in the statute book, then there's no way I can complain. That's when we refer or go to the human rights movement as such for redressal. And that's why we are reporting the way we did. And here, let me just point out again that there was once upon a time a very serious question arising out of this. What about the action of the insurgents? This question came about especially when the LTTE was very strong. They were almost a state, and they were also doing the same kind of atrocities that the state was doing. So why is that not amounting to human rights violation? And in fact, the international bodies did try to address this problem. They came out with the Geneva Convention Protocol 2, which India also was very enthusiastic in the beginning when it was being drafted. The protocol was being drafted. But when it was to be signed, most of the nations with internal conflicts actually dropped out, because for this act to come into practice, they needed some kind of recognition of a putative state. You are fighting another putative state, so that the state also will be controlled by this act. And the states with the internal conflicts didn't want this to happen, so all of them just didn't sign. India didn't sign, Pakistan didn't sign, America didn't sign. So many of these, the most prominent nations, they didn't sign at all. So you can't blame the journalists now. If that had been Protocol 2 had been signed, then we can also legally call the violation of human rights or the violence of the insurgents also as human rights. We can categorize them into human rights violation as such. But right now, what's happening is, even if the insurgents are killing, we still don't call that human rights violation. We call that law and order problem, heinous crime, whatever, but we still don't call it because the state itself is not doing that. The state, if it was called a human rights violation, then it will be, we are acknowledging that this is a war, not an internal problem. And the state has been so many times, Indian state included, has been so many times and over again saying that this is an internal problem. This is not a war. This is an internal problem for the internal mechanism to settle. If that's the case, then the press has every right to not call it a human rights violation, but a crime. It's just a crime. They killed somebody, that's a murder. But if the state is doing it, then we have every right to call it human rights violation, to actually scrutinize it on those terms. That kind of thing, it comes up if you look at it closely. So this is kind of one of the problems that we as reporters face in covering conflict, that we are not excusing the insurgents for their violence, but we just can't legally call it human rights violation until the state itself recognizes it. J.S. Verma himself had said it in one of the judgment, I remember. One of the most famous human rights cases that J.S. Verma ruled, this was Naga People's Human Rights Movement versus the state of India, where this thing came up, and J.S. Verma had said this is an internal problem, and international bodies cannot intervene in this. Supposing you were to, they had signed the protocol too, then one of the objections was that international bodies would be able to independently inquire into these problems, just as when war happens, and that didn't happen. So I think it remains where it is. So I think it's very, very wrong for the journalists to be blamed for reporting the way they do at the moment. They cannot just go about doing something else, which the state itself is not acknowledging, and that is one thing. And the other thing is that the whole idea of I would also even distinguish between reporters here who are reporting for a local paper. People are reporting for people who know the subject, people who are already into the debate, and you can actually go very deep into those debates if you are reporting for a local paper. But a correspondent placed here, reporting for a newspaper or a TV channel in Delhi, he will have to do it differently. And without actually realizing it, he does a lot of, I've been in both the situations, so I know that I would be, if I was reporting for a paper in New Delhi, I would be doing a lot of self-censorship because I know the newsworthiness according to that kind of audience. So I would be writing sensitive things which have been newsworthy for the local paper. I will not be writing them. I will be censoring them out and then sending them. And even that may be dropped because my sensibility placed there in the Northeast will be different from somebody who's actually looking at my copy in Delhi. So that kind of self-censorship happens. So that again becomes a big hurdle in actually communicating what is happening in the Northeast. Sometimes what happens is, as so many trauma writers have written, that people experience a certain kind of trauma together. We'll be able to communicate to each other better, and we'll be much more open to each other. And when they have to report the same thing to others, they will sometimes simply shut up. They will simply not do it for the simple reason that the assumption that the other people won't understand. They won't even know what it is we're speaking about. So when somebody talks about the fear of ASPA, and people in Delhi may ask, why are you fearing law? If you don't do anything wrong, you will not have to fear. And so, that kind of attitude will inhibit people in the Northeast to actually say anything about that because they won't understand that kind of attitude. But if somebody in Nagaland were to speak to somebody in Mizoram or Manipur, they will be open to each other. They will know the other guy will understand what he's saying, the kind of trauma that he's going through. So they will be much more open to each other. Because that kind of inhibition is also there. And in fact, writers like Kathy Carrot have called this the unclaimed experience. You have experiences, but you don't claim it anymore because you know that people don't understand. People don't even comprehend what you're talking about. So that kind of thing is also there. And I think this inhibition is also very much there among reporters, among journalists who work from the Northeast or want to report. So this communication gap is actually a very unbridgeable unless there are much closer kind of contacts between the people here, exchanges of ideas and all that. It's not easy for somebody there. Somebody there may actually understand what is happening and may want to say it, but for the same kind of inhibitions that I was talking about, they may end up saying nothing. And that, again, is a big inhibition. And here, let me just give one example. I was referring to Kathy Carrot. She's got a book called Unclaimed Experiences, where he was talking about, she was actually analyzing different pieces of literature. And there's one movie that she talks about, the Hiroshima Mon Amour, where, again, it's about trauma. You have, I'll just try and briefly capture it into a few paragraphs, or I think it's a long. So there was a French girl who fell in love with a German soldier when France was being occupied by Germany, and I was actually sleeping with the enemy. So a dangerous thing to do. But sometimes human emotions cross all these barriers. So they were in love. And what happens was, when the Germans were being beaten out of France, there was a celebration everywhere. And this man, this woman's lover, was also killed. Girl, actually, very young girl, was also killed in that the attack by the Allied forces. And while the rest of France was celebrating, she was in trauma. And also, she was being humiliated. Her family was humiliated because she was collaborating with the enemy and all that. But she lived through that. She almost committed suicide, but ultimately she overcame that, and she became natural again, normal again. But what happens was, on the day France was liberated again, there was a big celebration, and she was watching the whole movement with a trauma inside her heart. And then a few days later, there was the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And then there was celebration everywhere in the Western world. And she actually identified her own suffering, how she suffered, with how the Hiroshima must be suffering. So ultimately, after a few years, she had an opportunity to go to Japan. And there she falls in love with a Japanese man, and who was a Japanese soldier who was fighting away from Japan when the bomb dropped. So he was alive. So just one episode from there, I want to cite. I was just giving the background. So these two lovers, they were talking to each other, and then one day, the woman wanted to go out and see Hiroshima, and she does that. When she came back, the Japanese man asked her, "What did you see?" And then she was depressed. I saw horrible things, so bad, and all that. How can this be, and all that? And this Japanese man actually got angry. How can you say that you saw everything? Can you see the pain in my heart? You're not the Japanese. You're a foreigner. How can you say that you saw everything? You cannot see anything. I lost my friends. I lost a favorite street I used to haunt is no more there. Can you see that? You're saying you saw everything. So the question that was being asked was that is it possible for somebody who is outside a particular trauma region to actually write about that trauma region faithfully? Do you have to be somebody from there to actually faithfully record it? But if you are saying that objectivity is about somebody being a witness, then the Japanese man also is not a witness. If he was there in Hiroshima on that day, he would have been dead. So he may be a closer witness, but then he's still not a witness. So this thing about representation, this thing about history and trauma writing was actually well captured in this one. And I was just bringing up this particular episode to highlight what kind of things go into that area of inhibition. That so many reporters, me for instance, I've been here, but do I always write everything that I see here? That I will talk to local people about that, because they know that we are into that same situation. They would understand. But if I come to Delhi or Bombay, would I be talking about that? And I would have to explain 2-3 days before the other person begins to understand. So that kind of inhibition is very much there in any reportage of the Northeast. Can that person represent the trauma of that place, the actual heart of that place? Can it be possible? That's the kind of question that's been asked. And so what is objectivity, and what does it have an element of subjectivity, that? So I think I will end with these few observations, and later on, if there are any thing that comes up regarding what I have presented, I will add some more.
Thanks, Pradeep, for this extremely illuminating talk of yours. I think this is a major problem, especially when the state is so tyrannical about controlling the narrative and the language or the vocabulary of violence. They see it as a way of nation building, where they want to ensure that these kind of small conflicts can be managed, but it becomes a major challenge for journalism. So now I would like to request Teresa Rehman from Assam. I think she has been doing some great writing. She's an award-winning journalist based in Northeast. She worked at India Today, the Telegraph, and Tehelka before she began editing the Thumbprint. So she will tell us about how it is to report the citizenship issue and what does it really entail taking on the narrative of the state.
Thank you, Editors Guild of India, for inviting me to this important session on Unheard Voices, reporting from conflict zones. In many ways, I have broken a glass ceiling here today by stepping into an all-boys club and by being included in what has always been a very masculine discussion. A female reporter in a conflict-torn and inaccessible zone face toxicity with a degree of sexist humor and objectification for their camaraderie. There are certain circuits, even in informal conversations, where women are rarely admitted. There are many unheard voices, especially of female journalists, and some that will never get a space to make themselves heard in a region already fraught with violence, disenchantment, and alienation. So, does a journalist gender come into play while reporting from the periphery, a region that has seen several decades of violent insurgency? Well, in May this year, a 35-year-old journalist in Assam was told by the management of her TV channel, uh, that they had no expectations from her as she is pregnant, and she was asked not to come to office anymore. The reporter, with about 14 years of experience, said she was forced to quit as the management said that pregnancy could restrict her abilities and that the organization needed only agile persons as reporters. Her request to be sanctioned unpaid leave till childbirth was reportedly turned down by the management, claiming that the company had no maternity leave or benefit policy. This incident exposes the double standards of organizations towards its pregnant employees. The Maternity Benefit Amendment Act 2017 provides for paid maternity leave of 12 weeks, in addition to paid leave and extension of leave without pay for or work from home or work from home arrangements. Incidentally, the TV channel's owner said that she was asked to resign because they could not risk her health in the time of COVID. Well, I was heavily pregnant too when I was summoned by the CBI for exposing a fake encounter in Manipur in 2009. It was difficult for me to even climb up the stairs to the CBI office in Guwahati. All the interrogations and questionings by the SIT, the CBI, and the Judicial Commission was held specially for me in Guwahati, as I refused to go to Imphal in Manipur because I feared for my life. It took a toll on my physical and mental health. And it takes a lot of courage for a journalist to talk about his or her fears and vulnerabilities. For the past several years, I've been talking about conflict reporting with media students, researchers, and different stakeholders. And today I would like to reiterate some of the points that organizations like the Editors Guild of India can actually take up or could probably take up. I'm a first generation journalist and one of the few reporting hardcore conflict from Northeast India. And I had broken many rules and unlearned many theories that I had picked up in my journalism school in Delhi. I had flirted with danger several times. I was tired of the narrative flowing out of the region that was full of drab statistics of arms, ammunitions, weapons, and the list of the dead and the injured. And of course, the peace talks where only men talk. What was missing were the human stories, especially of the women and children. The region, which is often ghettoized as a monolith, is diverse, and so are its women, and so are its lives. I've tried to look at conflict with a gender lens, and it has been a lonely trip for me. without any guidebook, without any support system, and without any mentor. So this makes me reiterate the point that we lack adequate training to report conflict from fragile security zones. In fact, I've written about my experiences and about the travails of a journalist in Northeast India in my book Bulletproof. I also feel that it also implies an insight into the socio-cultural and political environment of the region, and the Guild could probably look at the curricula of the media schools, both private and in the universities, and ensure that a capsule on conflict reporting and safety of journalists is included. And another, unvisited area is the psychological health of a journalist. Like Pradeep was talking about trauma, it is important that we have conversations around the physical and mental well-being of a journalist. Reporting disturbing events and on the survivors of trauma tend to take a toll on your psyche. In fact, personally, I was surprised, as I was not aware that the repeated exposure to violence and bloodshed in my profession could stress me so much that I might have to seek professional help. So, there is a mental block and a stigma associated with mental health, and it is important that we break this stereotype. We need to reiterate that mental health counseling is not a sign of weakness or an indicator of your inability to perform your duties. And thirdly, I think we need a support system for journalists that includes a legal and social support. Reporting conflict can spring surprises in every step. The Editors Guild is an important organization that can build a mechanism in place and maybe collaborate with organizations that take care of journalists in distress. I've heard of the legal advisory panel of the Guild. This panel could advise a team of lawyers who would take pro bono take up cases of journalists in distress in small cities and mofussil towns of the region. Fourthly, digital safety and safety of our gadgets is so crucial these days. We need more sessions on how journalists can protect themselves and their sources by keeping up to date on the latest digital security threats such as hacking, phishing, and surveillance. So awareness workshops on how journalists can safeguard their information and what could happen if it falls into the wrong hands, and how to protect their accounts, devices, communications, and online activity is the need of the hour. Moreover, journalists working in remote and inaccessible terrains need support to deal with online trolling and the legal hazards of any online activity. For instance, a journalist in Manipur is languishing in jail on charges of sedition for a Facebook post. Finally, we also need, there's a need for collaborations and incubators for media startups in the region. With the fast evolving technology, Northeast India is also witnessing several digital startups, and women in different parts of the region are making use of technology to make their voices heard. In 2012, I had decided to explore the possibilities offered by internet and set up my own webzine, The Thumbprint. And people often ask me, why did I start The Thumbprint? I tell them that it was a very angry reaction. When I had to struggle to find space for my stories in the various national media forums, I decided not to beg for space and create my own space. So 8 years after the Thumbprint was set up, what had appeared infeasible sitting in the living room of my residence in a district in Assam, this online news magazine on a shoestring budget has managed to win hearts of people all over the world. And the genesis of this media venture penetrates deep into a wounded sentiment that has witnessed long years of neglect and apathy for a region which is a paradise for journalists. And we decided to carve our own space where we would be heard and seen. So we want to tell the world that we are not a museum, that we are a vibrant and a living world. And we call ourselves an international magazine with a Northeastern soul. And people often ask me, why did we call ourselves The Thumbprint? I tell them we are too tiny to leave a dent. At best, we can leave an imprint. But sometimes I wish someone had incubated us and trained us into the nuances of the fast-changing technology, online marketing, and etc., that would make this tiny venture commercially viable. And sixthly, I think mentoring young journalists and media students by seasoned journalists in the field could go a long way in building a strong and vibrant network of media persons in regions like Northeast India. The Guild could do a survey of women in editorial leadership positions and the challenges women journalists, women editors face in different parts of the region. The challenges could be as simple sounding as a separate toilet for women in the newsroom. A senior editor of a daily newspaper in Assam once confided in me that she used to hold on for several hours as there was only one toilet in the entire office. and she was too embarrassed to go and use it. I think the media ecosystem of the region is still emerging, and it's changing so fast, and there's so many issues that are evolving. We need more such webinars and conversations to bridge the gap, both geographical and psychological. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Teresa. I think yours is a very important perspective, as you rightly pointed out. You've broken a glass ceiling, and it is important that we get your views on this. All very useful points that you raised. I will ask Ranju Dodam from Arunachal Pradesh, which is a state which has not seen any violence for a long time. There's been no conflict. So tell us more about the nature of your reporting. I mean, do you share the same things with your friends and your counterparts in the other states, or is it different?
Hi, Sanjay. First of all, thank you to the Editors Guild for having me here. Amongst my esteemed co-panelists, I feel like such an imposter with perhaps the least amount of experience bringing into the field. So it's really an honor to be here with the stalwarts from our region who've been reporting. And as you mentioned, Sanjay and Tamu Pradeep and Teresa, they have all seen not just the birth of armed conflict in the region, but also seen its increased violence and now perhaps the transition towards peace. You mentioned that Arunachal Pradesh as such has not seen violence in the recent years, perhaps as much as the other states in the region. See, that's something that I wanted to actually touch upon. When we're talking about when I first actually shared that we'll be having this webinar, that the guild is holding this webinar, one of the first questions that I got asked by journalist colleagues from the region was, why is it that the Northeast is always called a conflict zone? Why are we perpetually stuck and in this definition, in this box that Northeast reporting is conflict reporting? So that's something I wanted to talk about, or rather, I don't have the answers. I have the questions. I have more questions than I have answers as to why is it that, how do we define what conflict is? Arunachal, yes, does not have any homegrown, or at least not an active homegrown insurgency in the state. But that doesn't mean that there is no insurgency. We do have the Naga groups active in the far eastern parts of Arunachal, in the Tirap, Changlang, and Longding districts, where the Naga groups have been active since 97, 98. The level of violence has never escalated to the same levels that it has in Manipur or in Nagaland or even in Assam. But they have existed, and we've seen smaller groups come up seeking something called Tani land, and then there were some other organizations that had come up in the past. But what I wanted to actually, because by the time I got into reporting and over the last decade, the violence has gradually decreased. There is relative peace, but that is peace in terms of the conflict between armed groups, between insurgent groups, between separatists and the government, and even amongst themselves. But that does not necessarily mean that there hasn't been conflict between people, between the different communities of Arunachal. We have around over 100 communities, 100 indigenous communities, Sadar tribes and sub-tribes, and there are communities who've been living here in the state for 4, 5, 6 generations, but are not considered indigenous to the land. There are conflicts between communities. There is conflict between the people and the government. Is that also the kind of conflict that we are talking about when we say that the region is a conflict filled region? Do we not count that as conflict as well? The issues that we write about, the conflict between government on any issue. Recently in Arunachal, in fact, last year in 2019, in February 2019, Arunachal saw the state capital saw massive outbreak of violence over the issue of identity and over the government's possible decision that it may be issuing permanent residency certificates to people of certain communities who've been living in Arunachal much before much before India's independence even, but are not considered indigenous to the land because they do not have scheduled tribe status provided by the government. Those that status is provided to just a few communities. So should they be considered indigenous to the land? Should they be given permanent residency? And massive violence broke out where 3 people died in the violence. There was the deputy chief minister's private residence was burnt. And you can imagine in any other place, in any other part of the country except for the Northeast, if the deputy chief minister's residence was burned down the way it was, that would have been headline news in prime time for at least a week. But it hardly got any coverage from what we call mainstream media or national media. That's, I think, one of the conflicts that I see. That is also the conflict that I see, that between the media here in the region and the issues that we want to cover and the issues that we want to highlight, but the same issues don't get the same amount of print space or space even in on television. I think there's a conflict in that also, that how we as reporters from the land who are affected by the land, for I think a lot of us in the region, for us journalists from the Northeast, who have been living here, who are born here, and who have been reporting here for a decade or even more. I think the conflict is also that we aren't divorced from the issues that affect the people on the ground at the village level. Those same issues that somebody in my village feels, I'm also affected by that. I may be living away from my village. I may be living in an urban center, but a decision that the government takes, or even if there's any sort of conflict in my village, I am affected by it. Maybe not directly, but I am also indirectly affected by it. And that's when we write about those issues. Personally, I've seen that I try to contextualize, and I try to frame it in a manner that is fair and balanced, as fair and balanced as it can be. But sometimes, unfortunately or fortunately, your personal prejudices, personal biases do come into play. So yeah, I mean, I don't, like we discussed earlier, we are pressed for time. So I was actually unfamiliar about how the concept, how the format of this discussion would be. I was under the impression that we would further be taking questions and discussing ideas rather than just me speaking. But like I said, conflict, first of all, I think we need to redefine what conflict means. I think conflict should not just mean conflict between armed groups and the state, but conflict should also mean conflict between your everyday public, your office going government servant, the municipality worker, in conflict with the government, in conflict with the decision that the government has taken. In Tawang, we've had conflicts with the state and anti-large hydropower activists being led by Buddhist monks. Monks and Buddhism, we always associated with peace, but if it drives people to such extent that they are willing to give up their peace so that they can make their voices heard, I think that's also an important point that we need to look into into our coverage and ask the questions from the government as to what is it that you're doing wrong, and also at the same time ask the people on the other end also as to the methods that they have deployed, if that's necessarily the right manner and the right path of taking of going down under. So yeah, like I said, I don't want to take too much of anyone's time. If any discussions, any specific questions, I would love to talk further on that.
Thanks a lot for giving us a sense of what's happening in Arunachal and how conflict is always casting a shadow on the state and the region. Surely we are going to take the questions now, but I think before that, Sanjoy has a couple of points that he wants to raise, and now the floor is open. I mean, We'll take about 4 questions, and you can please identify the speaker from whom you want, who you want to be answered. And after that, we will, ask Anant to come in.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just wondering whether you should ask your participants for the questions first, and if there's.
But you can start. They're putting the questions together, so maybe.
Okay. Okay, 2 very quick points. One is, I'm very glad that Teresa made this point about women journalists, because that is really an issue that comes up with the new media as much as the old media. And the need for women professionals to not just women journalists, but everyone needs protection in this day and age from the violence of the internet. That's one thing that I did want to say. And the other is that, you need a combination of efforts. It can't be just one thing or another. You need, for instance, fellowships that will enable people to work in other professional institutions, media institutions. You need insurance for those who are in, shall we say, risky zones, and better training and capacity building. But coming back to what Ronju said, I think it is not conflicts as per the state and non-state actor. It is conflicted issues, issues which are really concerned about, it could be land and identity, and it could be issues relating to ethnic concerns and so on. So it's a huge array of things that we need to be able to address, and that's where both sensitivity as well as deeper understanding of the issues that you're confronting and others are facing comes in, and that only comes with better research. We need better research. We need journalists who focus with a focus on good research and not just what they see on the net or WhatsApp. Thank you.
Thanks. So we have a question from Rahul Chandrawatkar, and I think he's saying that any of the panelists can answer this. He wants to know whether the editors in metro cities be sensitized to focus more on the Northeast area. Is that one way to increase spotlight on such an important area of the country? So Pradeep or Teresa or somebody, can answer this question.
Let me try that. This has been a nagging question for a long time, whether editors outside should be sensitized. In fact, it came up in one of the seminars a long time ago, and how not just sensitize the editors, but also compel, or entice the media to actually cover the Northeast. And I was suggesting that if the DAVP and other, because we all know very well that advertisement is the driving force behind all the media, and if the agency was supposed to, the DAVP were able to imaginatively program its distribution mechanism. For instance, many of the newspapers get a higher rate because they call themselves national papers. They distribute to several states, which is why they have a higher rate. So if you were also to introduce a system by which you say you have to cover Northeast or Kashmir, some of the neglected areas, to be actually entitled to become a national paper, then I think there will be some bit of coverage, because it's advertisement which drives newspapers, and if you link the coverage to the advertisement, to the revenue mechanism, then I think there'll be more coverage. I think, and this was one thing which I suggested, but it was during the seminar it was taken well, but it never actually translated into action. But I think definitely, I think we should meet more often people from the other states and sensitize each other on what is happening, and especially for the alienated region, Northeast, for instance, where I was saying that in the beginning that there was no, that in the national imagination, the Northeast did not fall prominently, did not have a prominent place, which is why even Ashok Mitra was observing that if the Northeast was separated in 1938, maybe there wouldn't have been any wounds. Now, right now, you do it, there's going to be, it's going to be hell is going to break loose. But at that moment, it would not have happened. In fact, 1952 again, Sardar Patel wrote a letter to Nehru, where he was actually saying, people beyond Kashmir, Kalimpong, people beyond Kalimpong, their affinity is with China. So you should be careful about fraternizing too much with them. And that kind of an attitude, I think it's been there. I'm not blaming anybody, but it's been there. The attitude of these people being different. And in fact, even the British had it, Olaf Karo, the Mongoloid fringe, we call the North-East. The Mongoloid fringe has to be treated differently. And I was saying Robert Reid was also doing the same thing. J.P. Mill was doing the same thing. They had come out with different plans for the Northeast. So, and this alienation was there. It's been there for quite some time now, and it's not going to be very easy to bridge unless real efforts are made. So, I think this communication between editors as well as other forms of intelligentsia is very much necessary, so that we understand each other. And also, not just that, but you also have to structure it so well in a different way. As I was suggesting, the DAVP, for instance, or the RNI, or the way you can become a national newspaper, unless you have some portion of your space reserved for the Northeast, you cannot be entitled to be a national paper. You can be a newspaper, you can be a metro newspaper, Delhi newspaper, but you can't claim to be a national newspaper. And if you have that kind of a criteria, then I think there'll be more coverage.
Actually, I can see a very, sitting here in Assam, I can see a different phenomena growing here. It's the surge in the digital media, and including the YouTube channels, and so it's like now there's a joke going around that almost every household will have a news portal now. It's like we have so many news portals coming up, and somehow people are not waiting for Delhi to deliver news to us. Somehow the 9 o'clock news is no longer sacred for us. We are creating our own pace. We are telling our own stories, and almost I can see different ethnic groups coming up with their own news portals. So this is a very interesting phenomenon going on, and I think it's like a counter to what the apathy and the alienation that we face all over the years, that that we don't care anymore. We are going to tell our own stories. So I think this is a very interesting phenomenon going on, especially in Assam. I can see a lot of news portals coming out. I don't know how regulated they are, but they are telling stories. They are telling stories. They are telling stories from hyper local stories from nook and crannies. It's really interesting. This phenomenon should be studied by media researchers, I feel.
So, Pradeep, there's another question for you, which actually challenges the narrative that only people who belong to the region can. If you think that there's somebody from outside will have a better perspective to report than the people who are staying there?
Yeah, actually, I was not saying that. I was saying that there is a difference, and I think probably it'll have to be, you'll have to be both. You'll have to be a good journalist will have to be capable of being both. That the idea of empathy, that you, as an outside reporter, for instance, you are not just, it's not just about sympathy. Yeah, I feel sorry for these guys. Or it's not just about compassion, I feel sorry and I want to help. But as Jeremy Rifkin says, it's about empathy. Empathy is about actually feeling what the other guy feels. And this is actually soft-wired in all humans. Apparently, we have something called the mirror neurons, that we can actually feel what somebody else feels. Supposing I see a spider climbing up somebody's neck, I feel uneasiness here, and that's the real empathy that's happening, and this can be actually cultivated. That the outside reporter will have to, as I was saying in that example also, the Hiroshima Mon Amour, where the French woman was coming there, sympathizing, empathizing with that place, and yet there was a bit of distrust from the Japanese man. But the Japanese man himself is not a real witness, because if he was a real witness, he would have been dead. On the day if he was there in Hiroshima, he would have been killed because of the bomb. So he's also reporting that bomb, and the French woman is also doing that. And Kathy Curran is actually saying that there has to be a balance between the two, that you have to empathize with the place, you have to feel with the place, and right, but you also have to distance it. There's a minimum of distance that you have to keep, because you are immersed in a situation. Maybe you get blinded, as that question. I saw the question also, where that you get blinded by emotions, and you're not able to do much more, see the larger picture, and you're only reporting your particular pain. But if you see the larger picture, then you see why that pain is coming and the other factors which have fed into that pain. That kind of thing can be seen if you stand at a distance. So I think we have to be able to keep that distance as well as be with the subject of the reportage. That you have to be a subject as well as an object, as well as an observer. You are the subject participant, as somebody called it, and you're observing something that you have also experienced. If you are able to do that, then I think your report is going to be most faithful. Otherwise, you're just either an objective reporter, that you also sometimes end up actually drawing a moral equivalence between the victim and the perpetrator. The victim said this, but the other guy said the perpetrator also said this. You're giving them equal kind of moral standing, which is I think it was in some ways so many people have objected that there has to be a point where, as a human being, even if you're a reporter, you're a human being, you have to be able to identify where justice is and report accordingly. You have to give some weightage to where you think justice is. If you're not able to do that, then you're just an objective reporter. One car hit a guy, police said this, but the magistrate said that, victim's family said this, and you're just putting them together. It's just that event becomes an attributed opinion of different people. But you as a person is absent from that particular. You are a witness as well. The reporter is a witness as well. He also has to give his witness account. He also have to give his judgment somewhere. So I think some bit of subjectivity is what is necessary, which is what I think, especially trauma writers. So I've been reading quite a bit of these trauma writers, Dominic Lacapra, and then the Saul Friedman and all that, where you actually, this objectivity can actually become harmful. It's not giving you the truth of the particular picture by just being objective. The police said this, but the killer said this. He had a reason, and the victim, who is dead or something, mother said this, something else. We are actually putting them on at an equal footing, which is what I was trying to get at when I say there has to be a balance between this. You are an outside observer coming there and reporting, but you cannot just neglect what the other. You cannot impose your own perspective on that particular situation. You have to actually understand what the people on the ground are understanding. It maybe sometimes it may sound ludicrous, but you have to also see why they're acting so ludicrous. And unless you're able to do that, I don't think that balance is going to come.
Thank you. There's a question which has come from our executive committee member, Mr. Prakash Dubey. He's been wanting to ask, holding back a few questions, although a lot of friends in the in the audience have actually sent in questions. Let's see how many we can take. Mr. Prakash Dubey.
You see, what is the position of Arunachal State in the Indo-China relationship? I want to know, how do you feel as a journalist and as a reader, as a citizen of the state? Thank you.
So I'll tell you, as a citizen, and first I'll answer as a citizen. And I think I speak on behalf of most people from Arunachal that for me, the supply of the PDS rice is more important than what the PLA is doing. It seems for the longest time that it was only the editors outside of editors and journalists outside of the region who were reporting on Arunachal that always want a China angle. Now I'll tie in the last two questions that were asked because I wanted to dive in onto that as well. That should we have a different Northeast desk? That would be wonderful. But my experience is, what they have taught me is that these are the kind of stories we will get. 80% of the stories from Manipur will come, and the Naga peace framework has will take another few years to be resolved. So 80% of the stories for the Northeast desk from Manipur will be on the Naga Naga framework agreement. The stories from Assam will be on NRC. The stories from Arunachal will be for hydropower and dams. Hydropower and the China issue. No other issue will get covered, because that is what a lot of editors outside of the region want. There are hyper local issues that are that affect entire region of the state. but those do not get reported. What is always reported, and unfortunately, I've had to do it personally myself, that whenever I've had to pitch in a story for a larger media house in based out of Delhi or Calcutta or Mumbai, that I've had to put the China angle. We've had to put the China angle, and and I wish I didn't have to, but but I understand. I understand that that is what the audience, or at least I think the editors think that that is what the audience wants, that is what the audience wants to feed off of. As a journalist, I find that as a journalist and as a citizen, it's an internal conflict for me, because I may personally not be China is not in my mind on my mind 24 hours a day or 7 days a week. I'm not constantly preoccupied with, oh, the Chinese are coming, they're going to come, they're going to attack. I'm not thinking of that. Neither is the citizenry of Arunachal thinking of that. But it seems to me that staying, as when we read, when you open a website for news website or watch any news channel, and any mention of Arunachal, it instills a fear in me. It makes me think that the Chinese are literally outside of my front door. That they're going to attack tomorrow. So that's a conflict for me. People, I know we have real issues. We have issues, everyday issues, just like everyone else in anyone else in Gujarat, which borders Pakistan, is not obsessed with what Pakistan is doing. If there are terrorists coming in from Pakistan, if there are if the military from Pakistan is coming in, they have real issues. We also have the same struggles. We want to pay our bills. I would like to get married and have kids and send them to good schools and provide them with good education. Those are issues that I would like to focus on. Unfortunately, I don't always get the platform to, because that doesn't sell. People in Arunachal, in a village, being worried about the lack of cooking gas. That's not sellable enough. So unfortunately, Ghoom Phir Ke, we have to write about what the Chinese are doing. So it's an internal conflict for me, my personal opinion.
It's a fact that conflict sells. Yeah, in fact, I used to wait in front of the Tada court to grab an interview with an alpha leader, so that though there are many stories in front of my eyes, I could do so many stories about, say, regional cinema or this, that, so many things have. Guwahati is such a vibrant place, but I'm sitting in front of the Tada court and I'm waiting for this alpha leader to come out, and I'll just grab an interview with him. I'll take him to the terrace and just give me an interview for 10 minutes. So, and I know I'll get space for that story. So
That's
very interesting. You want to come in, Sanjay, just for a brief moment?
Yeah, because just
hand over to
on
Anant.
Teresa's point is that there would always be appetite in the big media for these stories, and there'll always be space. But remember, you're at a time when, in that kind of a media, there is a constriction of space. So even if we have a great story on Manas or whatever it is, and the militants who've turned into conservationists and so on, that may get play, but there'll be other stories which will not. And I think what Aditya Sharma was talking about, this hyper-localism of reporting, is often by non-journalists. So, I have this whole conflict about the citizen journalist thing. I don't know what others in the Editors Guild feel about it, but I think there is a real challenge there in terms of not just the fact that you will have people reporting whatever they wish to report, but it actually may detract from the real stories and the real issues. And I think you need to be clear. We need to be clear about that, because there are no regulations on this, and this hyper local social media. It's not. I don't think it's necessarily journalism which is happening, and that is redefining again what journalism is all about. So
let me just add one thing here. In Narendra Samji's book, The Imperial Frontier, there is a chapter on Meghalaya. During the partition, what was happening was the Jantia Hills actually wanted to be with Pakistan, because all their producers have a market in Sylhet, not this side of the mountains. And Narendra had to actually go there and campaign and say that we'll build an airport to bring your oranges to India. So he joined this side. So ultimately joined. I'm just trying to say the same thing that Ranju has said, that you're more there are so many immediate questions that you're bothered about. And people from outside, again, the same thing, outside, inside, I talked about, see things differently. You know, the question that was asked, are you more bothered about in China? Nobody's bothered about China or anything. They just are bothered about their daily lives. And if you happen to treat that, if you have a policy that is good enough to treat those, address those problems, then I think that affinity is going to be much more. Not just on a nationalistic kind of thing that are you more loyal to there or this side, Burma or Pakistan? That kind of question is not going to help much.
Thanks a lot. I think it's a very interesting. I hope there's somebody from the government who crafts these narrative was listening to what you're saying. Surely Northeast and Central are not on the same page about the various challenges that they face at the moment. There are some very interesting questions that have been put out in the chat room, and unfortunately we can't take them. There's one about whether the growing linkages with Bangladesh is going to improve the situation. With the better connectivity with Bangladesh will help. You think the alienation would end? So there are some interesting questions, but this time is always short. And I'll hand over Anand to say his piece about vote of thanks plus whatever he wants to say. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Sanjay. I'll keep it very short, primarily because I think it's been an hour and a half of a very, very intense and serious conversation. So thank you all the speakers for not just sharing their perspectives, but more importantly, sharing very frank perspectives on the issue at hand, and also about the kind of stereotype, the kind of prejudices that exist with respect to issues around Northeast, and that within mainstream, within national media as well. So thanks a lot for taking out your time, for sharing all these frank perspectives. This was the first event that the new committee has organized, and we owe all our thanks to the programs committee, which was headed by Kumkum Chadda, and whose members are Alok Joshi, Sanjeev Srivastav, Shankar Singh Thakur, and Sunita Arun. Thank you all for organizing this event, and most importantly, thanks to all the audience members, because we were keeping a track, and throughout we've sort of maintained a pretty healthy participation. So thank you for sticking around. And the last word, as Seema mentioned in the beginning, Editors Guild is a voluntary organization, and there were very important issues raised in the conversation on things that EGI should weigh in upon. Of course, Teresa raised some very important issues about problems that journalists face, and more importantly, women journalists face, and journalists working in conflict areas face. Or everybody shared those perspectives, both at the meta level and at the ground level. And EGI would be more than happy to sort of weigh in all these issues. But at the end of the day, we are a voluntary organization, so we need all the help and support that anybody can offer. We'll be more than happy to organize more such workshops, or make sure that our panel of lawyers is expanded enough to provide any kind of legal help. But for that, we need active participation from not just EGI members, but the larger fraternity per se. And the more support we get, the more active we can make this organization. So please feel free to write to us with any suggestions, and more importantly, any offers of help. We desperately need that. We look forward to organizing the next round, hopefully in January. And till then, hopefully, we'll keep the momentum going. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great end of the new year and the beginning of the new one. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody.